It's my great pleasure today to be joined in this conversation by three extraordinary leaders whose institutions and companies really are at the forefront of powering ideas and solutions on the topic we're here to talk about today, which is democratizing wealth. My name is Ida Rademacher. I'm a vice president here at the Aspen Institute. I co-lead our financial security program. And then I have the pleasure of working out of our president's office, looking across the Institute, and many of you probably started to hear about this, looking at all of the different programs and leadership and fellowships whose networks are thinking hard about how you do create more deeply shared prosperity and more economic inclusion as a part of economic growth in this country. And Aspen continues to think about how it's an institution that can try to model some of the consequential conversations we need to be having about that work. So that's part of what today's conversation will be about. And let me quickly introduce you to our panel today. I'm really excited to be here with all of them. So to my left is Baiju Bhatt, who many of you might know as the co-founder of Robinhood. He's still Chief Creative Officer there at Robinhood, and really disrupted the status quo and how we think about wealth, accessibility, and the power of technology. And it, in some ways, was some of the inspiration for the titling of today's panel. So welcome.
Thank you.
To Baiju's left is Latha Reddy. Latha is the Senior Vice President of Prudential Financial for Inclusive Solutions and is also the chair of the Prudential Foundation. I've had the great pleasure of working with Latha for over a decade now. And for those of you who haven't had that pleasure, I can say that she's taught me a lot and has modeled a lot around what it actually means to do shared value work in a corporate environment. I think she's both a champion and challenges leaders inside of Prudential and across the private sector about companies and how they need to think differently about capital markets and the ways that those can drive financial and social mobility. So welcome, Latha. Thank you. And John Palfrey, it's great to meet you. I know you're a longtime participant, contributor to the Aspen Ideas Festival, but we hadn't had the pleasure of meeting. John is the president of the Charles D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Prior to this role, really deep expertise in technology, law, education, and really thinking hard, I think, in this role now at MacArthur of how do you harness the power of both impact investing and digital technologies toward issues of economic equity and inclusion. So thank you to all three of you.
Thank you.
As I've been thinking about our discussion today, it feels like it sits at the intersection of three of the program tracks, and not just one. So there's certainly the driving economy forward program track here at the Ideas Festival. But there's also We the People, which is really foundationally about democracy and trust, and the power of design. And we have had many conversations now about how systems, products, all of those things, even markets, don't just happen. There's intentional design for inclusion or not for inclusion, as the case may be. And so I see this conversation as really sitting at the middle of all of those, because at the heart of it, your institutions, both some of the newer ones in the room and also those that are over 150, almost 150 years old, we're really coming to understand how philanthropic innovation, how public and private innovation really could be harnessed in new ways, in collaborative ways, about how to have communities and individuals fully participate in and benefit from the economy. And I think that's really at the heart of democratizing wealth. Increasingly, we're coming to understand that that full conversation, that full participation in the economy is really not just about access to education and labor markets and how those work for you and work with you for the long run, but this idea about inclusion in capital markets. And many times that conversation starts and stays with a conversation about access to credit or access to a bank account. But we're going to go into a much deeper and more robust way of understanding that today. So that's all the preamble. And then really, I just want to get into the first question. And it'll be the same for all of you, which when you think about the work of expanding wealth and ownership or access to capital markets, why is that personally an animating topic for you? And how do you see that fitting into, how does it fit you? And how does that relate to society? So
Yeah.
your first question, Baiju.
Happy to start that off. Yeah, so when, about a little over a decade ago, when my co-founder Vlad and I had the idea for what would become Robinhood, the central idea of it was democratizing finance for a broad set of people. And in particular, we were excited about bringing the power of the stock market to a younger audience. And the reason for that was, I think, in large part because of our own personal experience. Both of us were children of immigrants. We both had families that came to the US because our family saw an opportunity for us to have upward mobility in the society. And that was a really, really big deal for us, I think, both as individuals, and was something that we thought a lot about when we would go on to create Robinhood, because we, at the same time, when we saw about a decade ago with things like Occupy Wall Street, a younger generation of consumers sort of not that interested in the stock market, we saw an opportunity instead to say, if we get more people a part of this system, that's another way of solving a lot of the frustrations that people have. So it's been a big part of my life, this topic, and it's quite personally animating.
So similarly, I am the child of immigrants, both my parents born and raised in India. My father grew up poor, and his family was not connected to the formal economy in the town where he lived. And that presented a lot of obstacles and challenges for him. He worked hard to overcome those, but he was the first one to say that the only reason he was able to ultimately be successful and pursue his dream of coming to the United States to pursue higher education and raising his family here was because of people who stepped up at critical moments in his life to extend a hand, to open a door, to do things that wouldn't have been possible despite all of his efforts. And so my sister and I were the beneficiaries of those generational opportunities that he created, but we were always aware of the fact that it was just a thin blue line that separated us and our good fortune between many others, including members of our own family. So that was the animating force for me, and so that years later, I chose to become a civil rights attorney when I began my professional career, and went about trying to build equity into systems. And that eventually brought me to Prudential, where I now focus on financial systems. And as Ida mentioned, we're almost 150 years old. And interestingly, we were founded really with the principle of democratizing access to financial security when we opened up a market for working families who couldn't access insurance before. And so it was a good place for me to come with my civil rights lens and think about finance as a social justice issue. And I've been doing that work ever since.
Thank you, and it's just great to be back. I really appreciate the invitation and to be on the stage with both of you. I cannot claim recent immigration for my family, which has been here for longer, on Indian land, of course, but for several centuries. That is not the motivator, although, of course, thinking about the various advantages one has through, not generational wealth. My family's been academics for a long time, but generational access, of course, is part of what is motivating, is to think about how to have a more inclusive economy. But specific to MacArthur and Chicago, where I'm now living, I would just mention the sad passing of your colleague and our colleague, Jim Crown, yesterday. And Jim was somebody who was really focused in this past year thinking about how can we bring economic prosperity to all in Chicago as one key way, through jobs and otherwise, to address the gun violence and other crises that we have in our city. And so just thinking about all the things that we do and care about, whether it's gun violence or it's any number of topics, health disparities and so forth, I do think that economic opportunity, which is not, of course, widespread and fairly so, and those who don't have generational advantages, in fact, have generational disadvantages, we need to put thumbs on the scale in that way, and I certainly see our work at MacArthur in that context.
Yeah, great. I think many times when we have conversations about inequality in this country, we do tend to shorthand that by talking about income inequality. And I think it's becoming more and more generally known that the dimensions and depths of wealth inequality are greater. And I think that it's also increasingly known that the functions of wealth operate differently in people's lives and in community than the incredibly important aspects of wages and income. The most recent data, just for those in the room, the bottom half of the population in the US owns about someplace between 2 and 3% of the wealth of this country. That's historically been, that's almost a high point, you know? That's about as deeply shared as the prosperity has ever been, and it's also a far cry from much of the rest of the world. So we actually have built some of the mechanisms, but there's a lot more barriers and a lot more opportunity going forward. And I would also, you know, say to that point that when we think about the future of wealth and the future of democracy, we see those as being tied together. But when you actually look at where most of those lower income households hold wealth at the moment, it really concentrates in two places. And so I want to start at that household level about where on a household balance sheet wealth shows up, because I think that first of the things we do is think about how do we disrupt those systems, and then we need to look upstream and think about the broader investment packet. So we're going to kind of go from the household level, and we're going to layer on a couple of pieces of the conversation. Those two places where wealth are held are in a home. Home equity is a big chunk of that, and the second is in investments, in stocks, but the majority of that for most Americans is retirement savings through a retirement plan, and we know that also, those things also have ways that system doesn't work. But I mean, Baiju, let's get into the places where you saw opportunity in terms of that investment and that ownership in the stock market. Mm-hmm. What turned you on to that as a place for innovation? Like, how did you go in thinking you could disrupt an entire huge industry, or did you kind of just go in with a sense that there's a new technological tool? Where was your starting point for Robinhood? Well,
The starting point for Robinhood, I actually learned about investing from my mom, who would do a lot of that on the side in our family. So it was something that I had known about from college and earlier. The motivation behind sort of what would go on to become Robinhood from that perspective of my own household was seeing that, growing up at least, my parents had really valued the importance of 401k savings, right? And saving for the long term, even as they were sort of trying to build a family and a life in America. And this is actually one of the things that I wanted to touch on with sort of the relationship between income, savings, and sort of the next generation of consumers. And this is actually one place that we've found a really interesting opportunity with a product that we just launched, which is our retirement product. So it's Robinhood Retirement. And the tagline for this product is actually "No employer needed." And it stems from this observation that we've had for quite a while around working Americans in this country. Specifically, I'll speak to my parents' generation. They had one job, right? And that employment match that they got through their employer was a really, really big deal. And as we look today, and as we've been seeing over the last, I would say since the pandemic, is with younger people, whether it's by choice or by circumstance, more and more younger folks are going to have multiple sources of income. Think gig economy, think flexible work, and it's a trend that's growing. To that point, it's moving a little bit away from the systems that have been set up for the last generation around savings, because 401k matches, as we all know, are tied to single employer. So enter Robinhood Retirement. We actually give a 1% match on everyone's deposits as a company, because we know it's powerful in giving people the tools to save money. Because when we talk to our customers, we see this, you know, there's a lot of competing factors for their money. But if you can make the prospect of saving for the long term something that they actually feel like that they can do, that isn't just this super abstract thing in the future, you'll actually get people doing more of it. And I think it's a few of these things that are pretty closely related, and I do think it is changing as the next generation is coming around.
And how many people are now using the opportunity? I mean, I think some of the transformational technology breakthroughs that Robinhood brought into the marketplace were just lower dollar points of entry into asset ownership. What is the growth, like how many people are you serving now, but what do you think is the potential for more Americans to participate in savings and investing within and outside of the retirement savings system?
Well, I would say the first thing on this point is investing and saving for for the future, thinking about the stock market, and just generally not sort of having the assumption that you need to be sort of foolish with your money. It's all changing with this younger generation where people are aware of saving money, they're aware of the stock market, they're aware of all these things. And we actually had the view from the beginning that if you could make the entry point for it much, much simpler, that's how you would get younger people started. So think zero commission stock trading, think no account minimums, think fractional share stock trading, right? All of these things that layer on to give the entry point for investing lower and lower. And you fast forward the clock a decade since we've started the company, we have 23 million, 22 million customers in the US that use Robinhood. And of that population, one of the things that we're really proud of is actually the mix of consumers that use it. So, one of the things we're very proud of is that our customer base is, from Hispanic Americans to African Americans, 2 to 3 times as diverse as our competitors. And when I think about what change looks like, that's what it looks like.
That's the piece.
Yeah.
Lata, I'm going to actually jump not into, well, you're going to make the connection between the work you're doing at Pru, but also one of the tools you have is the impact investing work, and one of the partners I know is something called Stackwell. So I want to just stay on this issue of access to investing as part of it. And then, of course, I will be remiss running the Aspen Leadership Forum on retirement savings to not say a little bit about this issue from our perspective too, but go ahead.
Sure. So, picking up on the theme of access, and it's great to hear the diversity of your customers, because that is something we're very much focused on, understanding that access doesn't always equal utilization, right? There's too much friction in the system, particularly for those who haven't been engaged in the past or intentionally shut out of these markets. And so we've been looking for opportunities around the theme of ownership generally, where we can work with partners who can take that friction out. And so you mentioned Stackwell, and Trevor, the founder and CEO, is here. And for those who don't know Stackwell, it is a digital investment platform that is focused on increasing Black participation in financial markets. And so we partnered with Stackwell to engage students at historically Black colleges and universities. And so we've seeded investment accounts on the Stackwell platform that are accessible to the students who sign up. And it's a way to help them get familiar with, comfortable with, right, and gain the confidence of being an investor. No financial risk to them, right? It's our money, but they get all the wraparound services that Stackwell provides around investor education, as well as additional resources that Prudential can provide around financial wellness and other tools. And so we'll learn a lot to understand what barriers may yet and still exist for these students, but at the same time, hopefully set them up for later in life when they can continue to participate actively in these markets. We're also looking at business ownership opportunities and working with partners like Project Equity and Ownership Works to help create employee ownership models at all sorts of businesses, so small, medium-sized, as well as large businesses. And through these partners, helping to promote the idea, to understand that there's a win-win for the employer and the employee, and to provide the technical assistance and the deep expertise that's needed to convert to these models. And just the last thing I'll say is we, interestingly, as a company, right, we are one of the largest investment managers in the world. One of our businesses, our private placement or private credit group, also is one of the largest providers of capital to companies that are converting to ESOP ownership models, as well as providing the capital behind that to help them, lead in those new structures. And so a big body of work happening around business ownership, equity, financial capital markets ownership, and then looking at other real estate things that are yet, different from things that have been done in the past.
Yeah, I mean, you're both touching softly on so much of what became front and center after the death of George Floyd, after the murder of George Floyd, which was understanding just the starkness of racial disparities. And really, that really opened up, yet after Occupy Wall Street, right, the next impetus of sobering reality of the disparities in wealth ownership across race. There was a lot of commitments, a lot of corporate commitments in that space. And we know, again, historically, about a dime of ownership at the most for Black households to every dollar owned by a white household. And if you weren't participating in the stock market, you missed really where most of the growth in wealth has come from, even compared to home ownership over the last 15 years. So finding ways not to just democratize ownership, but to de-risk it, it feels like something you're thinking about together there. So I want to bring in you, John, on that issue of equity and inclusion in capital markets. And you may be going to a different set of the tools, which is some of the ones that Latha talked about investing in other companies as well. And I'll just say one other piece of setup. We do think deeply at Aspen around racial wealth gaps, but we actually try to think across we try to walk and chew gum on this issue and think about race, gender, generation, and geography. And there's a bit of an intertwine of those issues and how they connect to each other. So I wonder how you both are thinking about the individual participation, but what are the tools that you're using at MacArthur in this way?
Well, thank you. We do operate slightly differently as a charitable foundation, but we really have three tools that we can use overall. One is to make a grant. The second is to do impact investing, which we joined Latha in. And then last, how do we use the endowment that we have from the family and actually invest that? And I think each of those three can be a part of the solution. I won't go deep into it, but as you mentioned, this does cross various different lines. So we work in Nigeria as an example. That's not so much about racial wealth gaps, but gender is a big issue, right? So I think you're absolutely right to think about it in a global frame slightly differently. But let's just stick for a moment with the US. We're focused on Chicago in particular, but it could be broader. With a grant, one of the things that we're best known for is the MacArthur Fellows Program. Some people call it the Genius Grants. That is a no strings attached, $800,000 award for 5 years. Do whatever you want with it. You can buy a house. You can pay for your graduate students, babysitting. There are all sorts of things that we learn, particularly as those grants are typically going to someone who has not been recognized in society, yet has amazing creativity ahead of them. And so we are seeing, when you are literally just giving the money, that people do really interesting, creative things with it. And sometimes that is just securing their own family or their own team. And I think that's an important way to think about philanthropy, is actually just giving the money, no strings attached, and actually trusting the person to do what's necessary for their community to cause that creativity. So that's one bucket. Bucket two is impact investing, and increasingly, there are many, many, many more billions of dollars in this zone, and could get even bigger. And in this case, it is taking, for us, we've committed $500 million to this, and the idea is to make an award to an entity that is looking at social return first, economic return second. So it is great when we get the money back, and actually having done this now for close to 40 years, we are more or less break even on this, just plus minus, probably 1% to 3% return totally. But the point is, you give it to somebody who is going to invest it in their community. They otherwise have not had access to capital. We're not looking for a 20% IRR or any of that business. And by doing that, and we can talk about examples, you really can put a thumb on the scale in terms of access to capital markets to people who have not had it. So in Chicago, that means the south and west sides of Chicago. It means our Black and our Latino communities in particular, our Native American colleagues. And that changes the way that the capital markets work in a city, right? And that can change home ownership, business ownership, and so forth. And the last thing is the endowment. So if the bulk of our assets are in an endowment, the way things are set up in philanthropy these days is that, typically speaking, or historically, people have invested that for the highest risk-adjusted returns. I'm a believer that it has to do more than that, that in addition to getting high returns, because that's where the grants come from, right? And the impact investments, you have to get some back, but it also needs to be mission aligned. So for us, that means investing in asset managers who are led by women and people of color. It means investing in mission aligned things in climate, and getting out of things that are not mission aligned, such as oil and gas extraction and so forth. So thinking about all those tools in slightly different ways, I think if we see all of those things as the levers we can pull, I think we can make a bigger difference than simply giving out the sort of classic grants. Not that grants the Aspen Institute aren't good grants, they are excellent, but we can do more than that, and we can do it in different ways.
We think you can too.
Yeah. And, right.
And I would say the other thing is, so within your institution, and similarly within ours, we've got, as you said, different forms of capital we can bring together. But the other opportunity is bringing those two institutional capital forms together.
Absolutely, because you build a stack, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And guarantees being a critical part. So
which we do a lot of,
foundations are able to put up guarantees to unlock private sector capital. And we did this recently, or a few years back actually, with Casey and the Kresge Foundation, where they put up to 30 million in guarantees with their capital that unlocked 100 million in Prudential's balance sheet capital to invest in things that were higher risk, but would have an outsized impact and potential to build wealth in Black and brown communities.
And the next is $1 billion. How about?
There you go. Yeah.
I don't think any conversations to start with less than $1 billion when you're thinking these days about capital stacks for scale and change.
I agree.
Do you agree? Anybody?
Aim for $1 billion for sure. And
Okay,
start
round
there.
up.
Totally.
Anyone?
I wasn't
Okay.
joking. Like, I think that our guarantees should unlock $1 billion in capital.
Yeah. I want to go, Baju, bringing you back in terms of the startup capital needed. Like we've done, again, at Aspen, we're thinking about startup capital for life. How do you think about the capital markets working for households as early as a baby bond, right? What does it look like for that to work all the way across? Startup capital for entrepreneurs is probably one of the biggest places where a conversation about closing wealth gaps comes into play. You're in Silicon Valley. I don't know your own startup story in terms of the capitalization of that, but when you see and hear what John's talking about the who's getting access to the entrepreneurial startup capital and what blend of capital is actually useful when you're trying to think about diversifying not only the kinds of companies that are starting, but like I would say that my little side, one step back is what we've often seen. We led a group for a little while called Nonprofit Leaders in Financial Technology, because it seemed like even when you had the most amazing mission goal for being a private company, that minute of buyout and acquisition, so many of the features of economic innovation that were actually going to get past a currently profitable customer were lost. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't just the startup capital, it was the ability to have some kind of patient capital to be able to continue to serve a population that has not been well served by market innovation in the past. I don't know what your take on that is from sitting in Silicon Valley, and how you might speak to both the impact investing and philanthropic investing power that you're sitting beside today.
I would say that, first of all, the MacArthur grants, growing up as a child, that was something I was like, wow, that's so amazing that you guys do that. And it was
I'm sorry I missed you. That was a terrible, terrible swing and a miss.
I had my academic sort of days, and then I had my Robinhood days.
Yes.
So
You've done just fine without us.
Maybe not super relevant for it, but I think that, just speaking personally as a child growing up, I thought that was very inspiring. And the idea that in the society, if you have good ideas, the capital is going to be there to help you do what you want to do. I mean, this was something that I think my co-founder and I took as granted when we started our company. That being said, it was not easy at all. I think that as I've seen the sort of private capital markets evolve in the time that I've been involved with them, I think it has gotten much more inclusive. And the thing that my experience from those days was there's lots of ideas for companies when you're getting started, but it's actually much more about the people. It's much more about the actual people that are going to be the entrepreneurs. And I think that is actually a much more understood viewpoint in the private capital markets. I think taking it a little bit further as it sort of relates to the financial institutions that serve these individuals, I think one of the things that we addressed and are continuing to address with Robinhood, and I think is really important in addition to sort of empowering people that are the creators, is making sure that our financial services industry isn't overly incentivized only to serve wealthy customers. Yeah. And I think that's a huge problem. And you see it across the board. When we started Robinhood, I think it should be not a huge surprise to people, but we were a little bit outspoken about what we were doing. And we were very direct when we would go and raise money from the famous venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. They were like, hey, look, there's a lot of companies that are really, really good at helping rich people get richer. I don't think the world needs another one of those. We're not in the business of making rich people richer. We want to actually see if we can help everybody else and see if we can figure out a way to do that that's actually valuable for us and a long-term profitable business. And I think we've seen a lot of innovation sort of companies that are started to help individuals of different walks of life get access to financial services, to capital, to investing access, all these things. And so I do think it's changing. It's quite different than it was a decade ago when the idea of young people investing was viewed as crazy. That's changed.
I'm thinking, John Rogers often sits up here. He's a Henry Crown Fellow, of course, founder of Ariel Investments, and I think would say the same thing. He's very, very animated around thinking about young people and investing. A lot that you think a lot about that other piece, which is how do you move from serving a mass affluent market to just a broader market of Americans with a company as big as Prudential? How do you get your head around that? How do you get a culture of a large institution to start to think about that and see opportunity there?
So Prudential now has a stated ambition of being a global leader in expanding access to investing, insurance, and retirement security. And so it is very much top of mind for us in terms of how we make that transition, because we have skewed to the affluent and mass affluent segment of customers. What we are trying to do internally is have the conversations that need to be had to change the mindset around how we fundamentally think about who constitutes a viable customer. The industry, right to your point, has focused on an income and asset base in terms of evaluating who we want to go after in the marketplace. That is fundamentally flawed, especially when we're talking about the extremes in inequality that we're seeing now. We are trying to move to a much more human-centered approach that takes into account the various factors that impact a person's ability to be financially secure. So if you think about the financial journey for all of us, largely the same, right? We get a job, we start earning an income, we start saving, we start investing, accumulating assets, right? All kinds of diversifying those assets, and around we go. That journey is similar for pretty much everybody, but the need states along that journey are very different for especially people of color.
Yep.
And so it's as much an emotional as it is a functional, right, set of needs that we have to care for. And when we start thinking about it that way and understanding the nuanced needs that people really have and stop thinking about communities as monolithic, right, it's going to take all of that to effectively serve a mass market. And that means, changing hearts and minds of people inside and out.
I'd actually just chime in on this a little bit. I think it's like the big stuff, and it's also the little stuff, right? And just one example that I think it shines a spotlight on this is if you think about what the sort of standard way of getting started with investing is for people, right? You need to have a certain amount of money that you've set aside to put into investing. And that's kind of the way that the industry has worked before we started Robinhood. And the problem with that is a lot of people just don't even get to that first step, right? It's like, in order to get started investing, you need to start with like $1,000 or $5,000. And that just doesn't work for a lot of people. So when you bring that barrier down and you build products that are specifically for people that are going to get started with smaller amounts, that's how you start bringing people in.
Yeah, and it feels like that's a combination, both at the household level and again, when you're starting to think about investing at a community level, what is affordable and what's the capital stack that's there? So you give a match to the retirement. The overall 401k system gives a match. So there's both the cost of the product and there's what's the amount of money you have to put into it. One of the things, we just put out a paper called The New Wealth Agenda. There's probably on your table, you could put your camera on it and download a lot of the reports that Aspen's been putting out in this growing future of wealth portfolio that we're building. But the framework really starts with this, just kind of a framework to think about how do you actually build wealth as a household in America with the kinds of things there. So the first part is just to go ahead and name this incredibly important piece, which is people need to have routinely positive cash flow in their life in an ongoing way. I often say it's really hard to swing a baseball bat when you're standing in a canoe. It's a level of stability and resilience that enables you to have any kind of ability to look up and look around and think about what's next. Even though we all know in hearts and minds that we want for our kids more than we wanted for ourselves, right? So you need that level of household stability. That income piece matters terribly. But then you need to think about amassing an investable sum and the affordable asset to purchase, the knowledge you need to navigate that process. Then we also have a piece of that framework that's about protecting the wealth that you have, because as we've seen in crisis after crisis, African American balance sheets have not recovered from the Great Recession, let alone COVID, right? They were just getting back. The longest economic expansion in US history, and wealth had not recovered for most American households, even in that 10-year process when we had the biggest stock market growth ever. So this idea of democratizing wealth is not a nice to have, but it also comes with exposure to additional risk, and we're talking about the most vulnerable households and the level of risk they already carry, the communities and the level of risk they already carry. I wonder if you could each say a little bit about how you think about de-risking this proposition of wealth as a tool in more toolboxes of American households and American communities.
I would flip it from seeing it as a risk equation and more how do we unlock assets, right, in communities. And it's definitely an asset-based frame that we think about disinvested communities, again, say in Chicago as one example. And here's one way I might think about it, which I think is increasingly possible, but is not overall, the norm, which is think about the fact that any small business owner, or for that matter, any homeowner, or a person living in a home, is actually paying a rent, right, to somebody. So if you have a barbershop, if you have a dry cleaner, you have a grocery store, whatever it is, you are paying rent to somebody. So there are opportunities, and this is, I think, where a charitable foundation can step in, and by the way, for-profit certainly could step in this way too. And yes, this would mean de-risking a transaction, but building on the assets that people already have. So in Chicago, there's a wonderful organization called Chicago Trend. Linnea Richardson runs that. I don't know if somebody might be here or someone you know. And basically his idea is really simple. It's done lots of interesting things, but here's one premise, which is imagine a small series of stores, a strip mall in a previously disinvested community. And you've got 3 small business people. They are working hard. They pay their rent. What if, when they pay their rent, they actually were paying, in essence, a mortgage payment, right? And at the end of 10 years, what if they own their store? Wouldn't that be a better arrangement? It's actually not that hard, right, for someone like MacArthur Foundation and others to step in and say, we'll in essence do the down payment, or we will, for the developer, the person owning the space, we will de-risk. But what you're going to do is unlock the asset of this business owner, who's then going to be the owner of her store or his store or their store, right? I think the same thing could be true, although it's not typically done in the context of homes, right? If you're paying your rent regularly, if there were a way, and there are some models like this. I know Knight Foundation invests in one in Akron, Ohio. What if the same thing? You're paying your $1,000 a month in rent, or whatever it is in rent, and at the end of that period, you actually gain equity, right? Just flip it a little bit. I think actually what you're going to do is see not risk. You're going to see the benefit of an asset mindset, which is those communities are going to grow and thrive in ways that you've never imagined before. Why that isn't the norm? I mean, has anybody ever heard of that before? It's actually fairly simple as an idea, but I don't think it's happening in a whole lot of communities, not in America anyway. And I don't actually think it's that hard to make that flip. And there's a lot of capital like ours that, we could do that as a charity.
I love the mindset flip. Lanier was with us recently in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is one of those across Aspen beautiful moments. We had a lot of fellows from Aspen, including one, Ashley Bell, who I'm not sure if he's arrived yet, runs a company called Ready Life that is doing exactly that, about underwriting basically instead of a mortgage and amassing the down payment, like basically treating your rent payments toward a mortgage.
Payment, and then it becomes the equity, right? And look, somebody has to agree they're not going to make a pile of money on the other side. I get that. But there are a lot of us, like foundations over, that can say that. That's what we're set up to do.
It was so exciting to have them in a room with a set of organizations thinking about the future of building black wealth and the possibilities there. So I would say that it is the innovators in the room that inspire the rest of us to flip those mindsets. And kudos to leaning in on that with people like Lanier. I want to go through both of your thoughts on that de-risking, however you want to think about that. I was at a meeting in your company a few weeks ago, and you talked about that $12 trillion insurance gap in this country. So when you think about risk, especially in the growing climate risk as well. There's just so many dimensions of that are both financial innovation, but also, wow, how do we help people in this democratizing wealth conversation? I want to do that. I'm going to come around to questions in a few minutes as well, so start thinking about that. But let's go ahead and have finished this line of thinking, and then if you all want to riff on each other a little bit, feel free, and then I'll come to the room in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, so you mentioned the $12 trillion insurance gap, coverage gap, and it's astounding, right? And millions of people don't have enough insurance to protect their assets. And so we are working through our individual life insurance business to create a set of less complicated products. As I'm sure you know, the products we offer are very complicated, and it's part of the problem, right? Why they're only accessible to the higher net worth families and individuals. And so it's one way of, putting things out into the market that are going to be more accessible and can help. So it's sort of the opposite, I guess, of the risk being that people don't have enough insurance coverage. We're just trying to get out there with more products in the marketplace that will help them protect themselves and their families.
No, I think that's a really good point. I would say, in the context of the risk around this, I'd say the biggest risk is the risk of inaction, and I say that specifically in the context of individuals, and we look at the inflationary environment that we're in right now, and I think it really puts that into focus, because for the individuals, right, it's the choice between taking the money they've got and setting it aside and having that asset mindset, like you said, which we see consumers, once they experience it, it starts to build. And it's the difference between starting in that early versus the inaction of not doing it and waiting maybe a decade or 2 decades. And I think that gets directly to the second point, which is about education, right? So you have people that see the opportunity, that want to be involved in the system. Our core value at Robinhood has been safety first. And one of the things that we do in this vein is we invest really heavily in making sure that our customers have education, and specifically education that's not like reading a finance textbook, but gets the substantive stuff across, but in a way that people actually want to consume it, right? So we've done things like podcasts over the years, newsletters, and a whole sort of focus on making sure that our customers get the education as well.
And you've got a whole different generational focus in many ways too, that I think we can all learn from in a different conversation. I'm going to come back at the end with a conversation to you about leadership and the roles that you see, the white space you see for where we need to go next. But I see some hands in the room, and so wait for a mic. There's somebody over here in the far corner. Please introduce yourself. Let people know where you're from, and please ask it in the form of a question after that. That would be great. And we'll try to get 2 or 3 questions into the mix. So we'll come over here next. Thanks.
Awesome. I'm Aria Florent. I run Liberation Ventures. McKinsey came out with a study that looked at the disparity in annual wealth flow between white and black families. The drivers of the disparity, there were 3 big drivers. 20% was driven by savings from earned income, 20% was driven by investments, and 60% was driven by intergenerational wealth transfer. So given what we know in the New York Times article that just came out, 70 trillion is about to be transferred. What do we do about that largest driver?
So yeah, I can take a stab at that. I'll tell you one thing about this that gets me really excited. As a part of building Robinhood, I spend a decent bit of my time traveling and talking to customers and just really trying to understand the stories of the things that they're saying. And the thing that I've noticed that's changed dramatically over the last couple of years is younger people seeing this that don't have that asset transfer in that family of their own and saying to themselves, I want this for myself. Like, I want to change this so that my children and my generations that follow will have this same kind of wealth transfer. And I think that the first part of it is like, it's very exciting to see a generation of people that I'd never heard that from before starting to really notice that, and then giving those people the tools to build that wealth for their own families. And I think the first part is getting people to actually realize it.
John, you want to?
And I would do a yes and for Aria, whose Liberation Ventures, to be clear, we fund at MacArthur, and gladly so. I think the work that you are doing to lead a conversation about how reparations could be a part of that and racial healing, I think is crucial. And so I think to think about how are the series of opportunities that we're looking at going to stack up. I think on the generational wealth front, as I mentioned before, even if you don't receive the dollars, you're receiving all sorts of other advantages, right? And some of them are actually knowing about investing. Some of them are understanding. So I actually think it's seeing a whole array of things, and all those percentages, Aria, that you shared, to my mind, suggest that this is not a one practice or one investment thing. It's actually seeing this as part of a greater whole.
Thank you. Do you want to add?
Just that I'm also heartened by seeing some of the families that are, right, some of the people that are inheriting that wealth getting into the impact investing game and getting into, right, they want to use that capital for good. They recognize they're just very lucky that they're getting that and that it should be used for the common good.
When we talked a little bit about the function, so there's a couple of questions here. I'm going to go ahead and take 3 or 4 questions. So we're going to go lightning round. So if you want to bring a mic to the front, and then we'll go here and then to the back there. And while right here, these 2 ladies here are there. And I would say in the mix of that, one of those functions of wealth, one of the things that the concentrations of wealth go hand in hand with concentrations of power. So when you think about the connections between wealth and democracy and wealth concentration in the future of democracy, this for me is where some of that conversation that goes across these Aspen program tracks come into play. And we can maybe, I wouldn't say, it would be very undermining to say wax poetic. This is, I think this is when issues of inequality become as existentially threatening as issues of climate change. When you think about the future of society. So those are pieces to think about and maybe to consider as we go forward with things. But let's hear a couple of the other questions in the room, and then we'll do a lightning round through. So introduce yourselves and please quick questions. And I just want to get a sense of what kinds of questions are in the room. We can always do more.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. I'm Jade Sands. I'm a KIPP alum and an educator. So I've heard a lot, and just thank you all for all the work that you've done. I really want to talk about education and wealth, because I think that when we talk about risk, and I'm so glad you brought up the risk, I'm thinking about risk of when I do get the money, what do I do with it, right? I'm thinking about musicians, sports players that I see when they have all of this money, and then years later you hear they're bankrupt, right? So what do you think are some visions or goals that you can set now to put this financial education for our younger kids, so that way when they're in elementary school, they know what these terms mean and they're ready for when they actually do get jobs at 15 and 16 years old, and how to save?
Great question. Okay, yeah, quickly there. Great. Yeah. We're going to just have a couple of questions in the mix. Yes, ma'am.
Great. Hello, my name is Jaleesa Hall. I'm an Aspen Festival Fellow and a DC nonprofiteer. So the question I have is particularly for John. So John, possessing an endowment is the very definition of wealth for nonprofit organizations. But too many social change organizations, particularly those that are Black-led, actually don't have this powerful resource, and they don't have enough of it. So in your opinion, how do you see major private foundations provide more inclusive on-ramps for BIPOC-led organizations so they can expand their efforts and actually build power for self-determination?
Education and wealth, younger generations, endowments and wealth. I love these questions, you all. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Joe. I'm one of the Festival Fellow. I'm also one of the Obama Foundation Asia Pacific leaders. And this question goes to all the panelists, not only from me, but also from my fellow Ukrainian. So from Burma, from Ukrainian, 2 countries struggling for democracy. So the question is capitalism or wealth inequality an avoidable nature of democracy? And the second follow-up question is, what would be your top advices for a developing country like Burma to avoid such kind of inequality in our journey of democracy? Thank you.
Amazing. Amazing questions, you all. Wow. Where would you like to start?
Do we have 1 minute and 16 seconds?
We do. We do. We're going to run a little bit over, note to self, but not too much. So I think, and then obviously I wanted to know them so we can find each other at the hot dog stand. right, over the course of the day. So please.
Well, I'll answer the direct question, but I did want to say just a brief answer to Jade's as well, which was, I think, such an important point around the financial literacy piece, and that was, I didn't say it well, but even if you don't inherit dollars from your family, you may inherit skills and so forth, and that I think isn't, and I think you were getting at that, but there's so much more to say, so double click or down on that one. To your point, such a good one as well about democratizing the access to the wealth that does exist, right? Some of it is growing new wealth, as we've talked about, but where the philanthropies do have funds, there are a number of levels to this. One is tracking demographically who is getting the wealth, and that's one thing that many foundations, including ours, is looking at. So are we giving it, to 75% white-led organizations? And how do we shift that to the extent that that's something that we are, in our case, stated and have a goal? Some of that is mapping it to communities. So we're literally mapping where our grants go. Let's just take Chicago again, on the south and west side, and less in the white and Asian neighborhoods and so forth. So that's part of it. I think part of it is dropping the barriers to application. So for general operating, we take no application. We have a gen op, no app approach. Likewise, not having high barriers on the reporting side. So how do you make it? So I could spend all day, but I'm at 0.00. But the point is, lots of efforts can be done. There's so much more that we can do and across the sector need to do.
I can jump in on the education question. So at Prudential, we're actually trying something with Rutgers University Newark, which is one of the most diverse campuses in the country. We're taking our financial advisors, our financial professionals, onto the campus and meeting with cohorts of students over a period of time to help do exactly what you said, begin to educate them on what it means to own something, to be invested, to earn an income, and how do you use that, how do you take advantage of workplace benefits when you get have that chance. And so we'll know more in the coming months, but really excited about that.
You just are left with the hard ones about the rest of the world. And
Oh boy.
can we avoid the levels of inequality we see in America? Can we avoid them here in the future? Can we avoid them in the rest of the society?
I think so. I think one of the parts about sort of the American capitalist system that I've always loved, and I think it's not something that people talk about very much, but I think it's just kind of an unusual thing that happens, is you have companies that go public in our country, in our society, and the norm is that whenever an entrepreneur, a set of entrepreneurs build something that is so valuable, it's one of the most valuable companies in our society, they do this thing that's completely counterintuitive. They say, we're going to take this thing that we spent all this time building, we're going to break it up into a million pieces, and we're going to make it available for literally anybody to buy. I mean, the fact that this is normal in our society is something that gives me tremendous hope and optimism. And I think that bringing that mindset to places where capitalism is just getting started, or where the sort of capitalism and democracy pieces are coming together, I think it's about getting more people involved and owning a small piece, making sure that the financial rails are there so that not just the wealthy people can own a piece, is super, super critical. And I think that that's something you can start with from the beginning.
Thank you. I think to wrap things up with this, the beginning of any democracy, the criteria of citizenship was ownership of property. And some of the best parts of the American experiment have been decoupling that, so that citizenship is really a right of birth. But there are certain parts of ownership that do create agency and dignity and choice and freedom. And so the ways that your own thinking and leadership in this space is helping us think about a next generation way to connect democracy and ownership is inspiring and important. And I thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Thank you.